M. The Media Project. Imagine a vibrant region that embraces innovative technology and systems, allowing individuals and businesses to grow and thrive within the natural and cultural lifestyle of Vermont. Imagine the Black River Innovation Campus. Our community includes business and technology programming, co-working and technology tools, and other exciting experiences that are quickly creating an outsized impact to our little corner of northern New England here in Springfield, Vermont. PC Mag rates Springfield, Vermont number 8 for the best work-from-home cities in the U.S. Join us in Vermont. Begin your journey at bricvt.org.
Hey, all you Are We Here Yet listeners out there. This is your host, Scott M. Graves, for another Are We Here Yet podcast. I'm excited. We're recording, by the way, not that it matters to you, the listener, on a podcast, but recording in the morning, so I'm fresh with coffee as opposed to in the evening when just the vibe is a little different. I had the distinct pleasure recently of finding a wonderful book called The Cities We Need, Essential Stories of Everyday Places. And I'm really pleased that the author is with us today. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani is with us to talk about the book, talk about her experiences over the last 2+ decades that led to the book. And Gabrielle, I'm really excited to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm well. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It is a bright morning. I'm excited to talk with you all.
That's great. I'd like you to start off for our listeners and talk a little bit about the process, because I think the process in and of itself is fairly interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Cities We Need started, I would say, a little over 20 years ago. Somebody said to me recently, they said, well, the book really happened quickly. And I said, well, it depends on when you think of the starting point. But I would say that the work that led to the Cities We Need really began in 2001. I was living in Brooklyn, and I am from New York. I'd grown up there, but not in that neighborhood. And I was interested in understanding what was important to people in my neighborhood. I had been working in lots of other places and cities around the world. And I'd started asking people for their guided tours of their neighborhoods. And I thought, well, I'm new to this neighborhood. Maybe I should do the same thing here with my neighbors. And as a photographer, I'm also really interested in not just photographing what I think is interesting or beautiful or aesthetically pleasing or any of those things, but in using photography as a way to understand cities and as a way to understand people's connection to places. And so I was interested in talking with people to have them tell me what were the places that were important and significant in their neighborhood. So I started asking my neighbors for their guided tours. And as I started doing this, people would say, oh, I have another person for you. Let me suggest somebody else. And I started to really expand who was taking me on those tours. And people would walk with me, and generally people would say, how long is this going to take? And I was like, well, really up to you, but pretty much nobody can stop themselves under an hour. And pretty much everybody likes to go
they'll say they don't have any time. And then it's like, well, you're listening to me. So, hey, I have the chance to tell you all about my neighborhood.
Exactly. And you find that, wow, people really want to be listened to, right? But usually we don't get the chance to talk about these everyday things that are so much a part of our lives. Like, we don't get a chance to reflect on them, and we don't get a chance to tell somebody else why it really matters. And that once you start, you really start to realize what is so significant about it. And it's hard to stop. It's pleasurable and it's enjoyable to actually be able to talk about what matters to you, even when it feels small. So I did that work. I would then take these walks with people, and then I would go back and photograph all the places that they had taken me to. Sometimes I photographed while we were on our walks, but most of the time I would return to the places, photograph them, and then I would return to my tour guides. So all these people I started calling my tour guides, and I would say, can I show you the photographs that I took of your place? And I think that was an important part for me as a part of kind of a shared experience of doing research together, to say, here's what I saw when you were showing me that. What does that seem like to you? And so I was very interested when people, it was lovely when people said, oh, I love this photograph. But I was also very interested when people said, I love the photograph, but it's actually not how I think of that place. And it started to be a way, it started to be a way for people to say, I couldn't explain it to you when we were there, but looking at this, I'm able to take a step back and be able to talk more about what's really meaningful. Or people would say, yeah, I pointed to that, but let me tell you the real story behind it. So that combination of kind of an embodied experience in place where we would run into people, I'd think about like how fast or slow somebody would move through the space or through the neighborhood, and this very like much more reflective kind of conversation using photographs. People would always hold them in their hand. So that back and forth was very important in terms of the process of the project. And I started to be interested in doing that work, and from what I was learning, not just in Brooklyn or not just in New York, which can have its own way of feeling like, well, yeah, who cares? That's just New York, and maybe it's only relevant to like the people who live there. And I thought, I'm not just interested in New York. I'm interested more broadly in people's connection to place. And so I started to think about, interesting kinds of a contrast or a comparative place, and ended up moving to Oakland in California. So that, I sort of thought, maybe this might be an interesting comparison. This might be a place that looks very, very different, but maybe has some of the same shared histories of either kind of pre and post-war urbanism, relationships to industry, things like that were the histories of these places actually shared some important pieces. And I started to do the same thing there. I started in my neighborhood in Oakland, which is called Mosswood. I started to ask people for their tours of whatever they considered their neighborhood to be. And, as you know, people in California, they also drive. They don't always walk.
Oh, they have to drive everywhere, don't they?
So they drive. And so that was very interesting and important to me to say, well, of course, like I said, I would start off saying, could you take me on a walk? And they were like, no, but I will take you on a drive. And, starting to think about how even driving is a kind of embodied experience. I would, getting into somebody's car, you sort of it is quite an intimate experience of, kind of seeing like, what do they listen to? What's the feel of their car? How do they kind of relate even from inside a car to the rest of the neighborhood? So all of those things started to come into play in Oakland. But I did the same thing. So I would photograph places that people had taken me to, and people told me amazing stories in both places of these places. People would tell me in both Brooklyn and in Oakland, people would tell me incredible stories at their supermarket or at the donut shop. And very often they were either histories of the neighborhood that I didn't know. Very often they were very personal stories, but that happened in public. And sometimes, very often, they mixed kind of both humor and very sometimes very painful stories.
Really, both personal and painful stories, right? Like the true personal history of the neighborhood seen from that single person. When our listeners grab the book, they'll readily see, there's a great pictorial review of these places, right? So speak to that for a moment. What are the places that are important to people?
Yeah. So they really ranged. And I would say, I would never say, ask people, take me to these specific kinds of places. I just said, take me on a tour of your neighborhood, whatever that means to you. And so a lot of the times, the places people took me to are the places that, we go to on a daily basis, right? So a diner or a supermarket, a donut shop, or sometimes people took me to places that I thought, wait, is this even a place? Like I had no idea. So, where it was like, well, it looks closed from the outside, but actually let me take you in the back and I'll show you what's happening there. Right. So these bike shop and were
in New York.
Like, right. Like the bike shop or also in New York, Neville took me to, it was a particularly very special moment for me. He said a friend of his had passed away, but that he had a like a hardware store, basically a hardware store and electronics repair store. And he had said, well, before he passed away, this whole group of all of us, we used to get together in the back of his store, and we would, have on Thursdays, we would have food and we'd have a little drink and get together. And, most of the guys, they were older guys. They were mostly West Indian, and it was a way for them to kind of gather and build sense of place and sense of belonging. And so he said, well, but since he died, the store's boarded up, but we still meet in the back. And so and when he said, oh, actually, it's Thursday, let me take you in. And so really being able to see like these places that are sort of this hybrid of very personal, but also public, that where kind of people are making sense of place, they're making places for themselves to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of being valued, but also a sense of capacity to feel free. That was happening in, not just explicitly gathering spaces, not just in people's homes, but that, in these very everyday places that had kind of a purpose that was totally different.
Right.
People were having these very, important and kind of essential experiences of their lives that were both about building their own sense of self as well as building their sense of community. And I think for me, so my background is both as a photographer and as an environmental psychologist, which nobody knows what that means. And what it basically means and what it means to me is I always talk about it as kind of a social science approach to understanding people's relationship to place. And so in that context, I'm also really interested in, if it's psychology, right, obviously thinking about how that relates to the individual. But I'm really interested, it sort of encompasses the broader environment, so we can sort of think about the different layers and the levels of what it means to be in the world, right? So kind of from a personal experience point of view and what it does to shape the individual in terms of our psychology, but also kind of more of an anthropological look in terms of shaping culture, and a sociological look looking at kind of like how all of these things connect, right? What does it look like to see this as part of larger systems, and then how is it creating our larger societies?
One of the striking things is in so many of the stories, as people are recounting their story, everything they're recounting to you is melding between, very personal moments and very specific places. They're immediately, even though I don't know that they're necessarily fully conscious of it at all times, equating that to larger movements within society. An example of this, Lois is who was in Mosswood, is talking about, she was coming of age. And so for them, the highway being built, which was basically bifurcating the neighborhood, it was disruptive to say the least. That was a playground for the kids. It immediately becomes a betrayal to the kids when they can't go there anymore, right? Once the highway is completed, which speaks to the larger issue. Here we are 60 years on from the height of our interstate highway system being built, and we're dealing with the consequences and kind of asking ourselves, man, was that the best decision, right? how we hollowed out neighborhoods. And, they were usually poor neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods where we did that. We didn't do it, we didn't tear down a bunch of mansions to build a highway system in America. But, in a time when people are saying, well, a lot of folks are just disconnected, right? I didn't find anything remotely sort of alluding in the dozens of stories recounted in your book. There's nothing disconnected about it. And in fact, people are talking in very natural ways. And again, they're equating larger movements with their very personal stories that sometimes the entirety of the story is taking place on just, literally in one neighborhood. It's just a couple of blocks, right, is where they spend most of their living,
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's so important is the way that people, another one of my tour guides in Mosswood, I had sort of described this whole project to her, and she had said, oh, okay. So, and this is Cynthia, and she had said, oh, I see. Your whole thing is about how people fit the big world into their small worlds. I was like, yeah, that's a lot shorter way of saying it. Thank you. There you go. And I think that's the thing, right? Is to say people have once you actually pay attention to how people navigate their world, very often people have a very sophisticated way of understanding how politics shape and construct their own experience or their capacity to either feel a sense of belonging or disrupt that capacity, right? Right. Feel a sense of freedom or disrupt it. And that very often people are able to say, actually, I know exactly what. Here's the big thing that was happening. Let me talk to you about how that felt, right? And I think one of the things that's so important in all of this is it's not just the big thing that happened, that it's that the ways in which that impacts people, it doesn't just impact that one person, it impacts their families, it impacts the way that they kind of go out into the world. And that then shapes the world that we all live in, right? So that we have to kind of come to this moment of saying, okay, we do all live in a shared society, and that when we harm each other, it's not just harming each other, it's actually harming the whole society, because then you have these wounded people who are coming out into the world, and what is it that they bring or are no longer able to bring to the world, right? What are they not able to, of their particular gifts or their particular capacities, what are they not able to bring because you've bulldozed their house or their neighborhood, or they no longer have a sense of belonging, right? So that looking at, these histories of urban renewal, which certainly happened across the country, either in terms of building mass housing or in terms of building, which generally wasn't for the people who got displaced, or in terms of building the highway system, right? Those are tools that we used to build this kind of infrastructure in America, but that we are very much still living in the consequences of that world, right? In this kind of separation in neighborhoods, the further and segregation is a huge part of all of our cities, and has been, right? And so that people very often don't talk about it exactly that way, but that it is very present in many people's stories. And so I think, and when there's that, some of the places that sort of help people escape that can be in these kind of very small ways, but how significant that really can be. And I think that's what came through in so many people's stories.
There are obvious things that were done wrong or are being done wrong, right? We can all agree redlining is a problem. It's a policy and it's a problem. We can all agree, well, I think a solid majority of people would agree that the national highway system as it was produced, it has a whole bunch of negative consequences. It had some positive consequences maybe for a period of time, but generally, or let me put it a different way. If we said we're going to put a highway through your neighborhood, there isn't a neighborhood in the country that's going to say, yeah, sure, why not, right? Mm-hmm. These are obvious things, but there's something a lot more subtle going on in the book, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are after having not to put any pressure on you as the authority, but I mean the fact of the matter is you've talked to dozens of people over a very a meaningful period of time, right? There's something more subtle here, and that is, how do we again, in infantilizing the argument, gentrification is bad, right? Generally, most people would say gentrification is a problem. But if we put this stuff on a spectrum, right? We say we want vibrant, dynamic, ever-changing cities, that's better for people. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And at the same time, especially at a personal level, that change can have negative consequences, right? Where do we balance this out? What things, because not everything is an obvious argument. It's obvious not to do this policy or this measure. But there's other things that are a lot more subtle. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things, just even to go back to we agree gentrification is bad, is that I don't know that everyone agrees that gentrification is bad, and which that is a problem in and of itself. But I think there is one of the things that I like to, I try to not use that word as much as I can. Sometimes it's very helpful because it sort of helps to situate where we are, and that is genuinely what has happened in many cities. But I like to describe the impact of it rather than the term, because I think we can say, yeah, I think it's bad when people lose their homes. I think we can agree on that. Like, displacement is bad, and I think if we start to use this language that actually helps us be more descriptive about the impact, then we can start to say, we don't need to kind of just talk to talking points. We can actually talk about what the impact is in the world. And I think that more broadly, even, I think it's really helpful to be like, well, let's name what the impact of this policy is going to look like. Not what it promises, but, what's the actual impact, and not kind of naming it one thing or another, but actually saying, all right, what does this do to the people who live in this neighborhood? What does this do to the people who work in this neighborhood? Are there things that we actually really want to value, but the way this policy is going to be enacted, those things will no longer be valued? How do we talk about that kind of thing?
The Vermont Technology Alliance. The VTTA is the only statewide organization focused on Vermont's tech business sector and entrepreneurs. Our business members are Fortune 500 companies, startup founders, small business owners, and soloists. We provide advocacy, recruiting of tech talent, events, and other networking opportunities. We are the heart of the tech ecosystem in Vermont. Become a member now at vtta.org. The Vermont Technology Alliance. Tech thrives here.
And so part of what one of the things that I did with this work, particularly in Brooklyn, was to bring some of these stories that at that time were sort of 10 years prior back to the neighborhood in this kind of public art and dialogue project in 2015, 2016, because there had been a huge development at the edge of the neighborhood, which, spoiler alert, is not finished yet and had begun in 2004. And at the time, many people said, this is going to spur displacement. It is not, it's the targeted income bands that this building is going to be built for aren't really going to serve the neighborhood. Oh, it's really out of scale with the neighborhood. Many people had brought these critiques to the fore and had been countered with, well, they had a basketball stadium as well as part of it. So, you're just against sport and you don't want children to play basketball, which is like, there's not that many children that play basketball in NBA arenas, but whatever. Who's talking about the detail? And this sort of like, when you're against growth, right? And so one of the things that I think is so important is to say, well, how do we look at the details of this work? How do we look at the details of saying, okay, this is how we actually build housing that actually serves a neighborhood or serves the largest group of people whose kind of housing needs we need to meet? How do we actually do that? And how do we do that without displacement? Like, how do we say, yeah, maybe that's possible to do that, that displacing everybody in an existing neighborhood would be bad. And also, we want to build more housing, right? Or we want to, build those new amenities. How do we do both of those things at the same time? And I think part of what I want to do with the book is to be able to say, part of what seems really important is to say, well, how do we value the things even before we value them? How do we notice the things that are actually happening in these neighborhoods? How do we notice them? How do we name them? Because I think without naming them, it makes it really hard to hold on to them, right? So
Right.
part of my interest in saying, all this stuff and these stories that people are telling me, it's not just, well, that's nice to have, but that these places are doing what I call place work, right? That actually gives people both the sense of building sense of self and building sense of community. And that happens in these very unassuming sorts of ways and these very unassuming sorts of places, which one might not think were important to preserve. Yet, if we step back and see what they do, we would say, yeah, people having a sense of place and sense of belonging and capacity to feel free. Yeah, I think that would be pretty important, right? So part of what I think is important in doing this kind of work, which is really hard to hold on to, right? The everyday is very hard to hold on. It seems sort of like, well, why do I care that much about this? Like, who cares in the long run, right? Is to be able to track back and to say, okay, well, what bigger impacts does that have, right? If people don't have a sense of belonging in their community, if people don't have capacity to talk to their neighbors, whether or not they're similar to them, that's a real problem, right? Because
Right.
that has, one might say, a national knock-on effect, right? If we're not actually able to talk with each other, and the place that we do that, the place that we practice that in a low stakes sort of way is in these everyday spaces, right? And so that then become like hearing these stories, which I think are so important, and I really cherish the things that people share with me. And I think is really important to be able to sort of make, I don't know, a beautiful thing that holds those stories and values them, but also to kind of hear what they are actually saying in terms of what these places do for them and do for all of us in the world. That then becomes like a shift to be able to say, all right, what is it? How do we plan for these kinds of things? How do we actually support and value the kind of place work that these people are talking about, understanding that that's part of what, is part of what builds a functional society. So one of the things that that doesn't answer the how do we fix gentrification question. But I think that for me, one of the big things that I'm always interested in sort of pushing is to say, how do we sort of push forward to value these ideas, to see them, to hold on to them, to value them, and to name what we lose if we lose these kinds of places.
Yeah.
And that becomes an important tool for kind of helping us kind of see a way forward.
You give us an important, priority to reprioritize, which we don't in development largely, which is you need to intentionally place the priority in the design of a place in the first step, right? We don't typically do that. So gentrification in and of itself as a term, as a phenomenon that happens, doesn't have to displace people. Right. It can mean the increased economic activity to the benefit of the people who already live here. We don't have to displace people. We don't have to build basketball stadiums that displace people. We can build those people into the physical environment of the basketball, stadium. These are not things we do, right? But we could, right? It's not an issue of there's all the reasons why we can't do that. Well, but we've never really tried to do those things. Do you think that some of it, you point out in the book, this disconnect between housing as a commodity, right? And this is something that those of us in housing, whether we're in development or advocacy or so forth, this is increasingly at the fore of arguments, right? There's a disconnect between housing as a commodity, housing as an investable thing, which is increasingly invested in with what I'll call generically hot money, right? Fast returns, big returns, quickly as possible, get in and out, versus our inherent need as human beings to belong to a place, to create a place for ourselves. And you've embodied that argument just great in the last few minutes. I mean, if you're looking to I'm looking for a specific comment on the sort of that disconnect. And was that something you designed into your program in the first place, or is this just what came out after, several decades of talking with dozens of people?
Well, so I mean, I will say that so my first book was about called Contested City, was about a failed urban renewal site on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And and I have broadly done a lot of work kind of just looking at housing particularly. And so I'm really interested in seeing, how do people actually fight for the housing that they need? What does either having that housing, having supportive housing, what does that do for people? Like how powerful that can be on people's lives and their capacity to, again, kind of like housing as like the place you go out into the world from. Like, how is that possible to do in a really incredible way? And then what does it look like when people lose that housing, right? So all of that becomes a huge part of the work that I do. And I'm quite, find really important to think about, well, also what's this relationship between, particularly for this book, like this kind of intertwined relationship between housing and small businesses, right? Thinking about the ways in which housing is often, people are very often in very tenuous housing situations, and also that small businesses are often in very tenuous, especially rental situations, right? What are the things that happen in the way that we do development, or that, as you were saying earlier, like as we do investment, that kind of prioritize making money, but don't actually prioritize building cities or building the things that are the things that people actually need, right? Or that incentivize keeping a storefront empty, whereas we really should be incentivizing having all of the storefronts filled, right? That's what's actually good for our communities and for our neighborhoods and for our sense of place and building a city. So, thinking about the ways in which those policies actually actively disincentivize from some of the things that would actually help support, people's deeper connection with place, which, as we know, does a huge amount for, our capacity to, participate in the larger democratic system. Like if you have a sense of place and a sense of belonging, right, then you actually maybe care about your neighborhood. Maybe you get more involved in making decisions about it. If you feel like things change because you get involved, then maybe you also get further involved in all other kinds of decision-making processes. So that the things that happen at these very local level and the way that they impact people's lives really have this much larger knock-on effect. And I think that then is something that's quite important to think about, right? And so one of the things I'm always like, it's not that we can't do these things, right? One of the things that, I think is so important is to be able to say, it's not impossible. It's just a shift in the ways in which what we value, right?
We either do it or we
prioritize,
right?
Yeah. We had to make the decision to actually value people, to actually value the places in which they are able to be themselves and actually be able to come together as a community, or we don't, right? I mean, either we think about housing as a commodity or we think about it as places where people live. There's one or the other, really, right? Which doesn't mean that there's not a whole lot to be said about, well, how do we actually do that development? We do have a housing crisis. So across the country, right? And maybe that looks slightly different in different places, but that's very real. And so how do we do that in a way that's actually like solves the problem or gets to the heart of what as a larger society we actually need.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's the
Take us, wrapping this up, take us back to Mosswood, take us back to Prospect Heights today. And what do you have to say about each neighborhood?
Oh, well, actually, sorry, I was sort of describing that public art project, and one of the things that was in Brooklyn and Prospect Heights, and one of the things that was so important about kind of bringing these stories back there at the time, so that's now not quite 10 years ago, was that people were able to say, oh, wait, I thought things just sort of seemed to be changing yesterday, but actually I can see a bigger arc of time, and that makes me ask these kinds of questions, right? Even though 10 years is not that big an arc of time, but it was dramatic in that many of the places that people had told me about in the early 2000s by 2015, 2016 were no longer there. And so that people would say, oh, wow, that was what this was. Oh, I had no idea. Oh, wow. That makes me, I wonder what that means about, that thing down the street. Do you think that has an impact on this? Or what does that mean? Or actually, or people would say, well, everybody who's new isn't bad. Like, that's not what I want to say. And I would say, well, okay, but what is the impact of all of this? How do we talk about that? How do we talk that through? How do we talk about what's positive and what's good? And also, how do we talk about what's being lost? Like both of those things are so important, and to give bigger context for all of this. And so one of the things I would say, Prospect Heights is a very, very gentrified neighborhood now, very, very different than when I started doing work there in 2000, 2001. Both in part spurred by the Atlantic Yards project, which is now called Pacific Park, which is a whole nother thing. But the impact of this very large scale development, was originally supposed to be partially affordable, but that affordability, we don't define what affordability is in New York City.
Subjective.
So, depends on who you are, I guess. All of that has had a real impact on the neighborhood. So it's a much, much more expensive neighborhood. It's one of the most expensive in the city, across Brooklyn. In the last 20 years, housing prices in New York have skyrocketed. And I would say one of the things that's also really has been important for me in terms of comparing this and looking at Oakland too, is that, kind of this project kind of arcs the crisis of 2008. And so a lot of people were hit really hard in Oakland, especially people who, there's a bit more home ownership there. So a lot of displacement due to the subprime mortgage crisis. But the ways in which what I would have said, the rents were not at all parallel in, say, 2001 in Brooklyn versus in Oakland, that by 2019, 2020, they had actually gotten to be almost the same, which is shocking. And so also points to a huge amount, so the Oakland dealt with, the cycle of tech boom and bust, right? Multiple times. And to think about the levels of displacement that would happen in a place like that, where over 20 years, you have this explosion of high rents that really, really is changing and threatening the character of the city and the neighborhood, while also having its own challenges, right? So, and so the Bay Area and New York are complicated places, but I think also point to some of these larger questions that actually get played out in lots of places across the country, that we've all been sort of dealing with variations on this. And so what does that look like? So at the moment, the Prospect Heights is extraordinarily gentrified, very expensive. Oakland, I would say, and Mosswood, were hit really hard by COVID. The capacity for people to, work remotely, which, not necessarily a bad thing, but it meant that people could leave. And so often people left these very expensive new developments and now do not bring any of their money into the local economy at all, right? And so now a lot of those buildings that were sort of built and unfortunately finished in like 2019, 2020, are largely empty, right? Or certainly nowhere near full, and all of their retail spaces that were at the bottoms of them, those are empty. So a lot of the things that, what happened with this kind of explosion of this idea that there was going to be this sort of endless explosion of growth and people who could pay a lot of money to live in both of these neighborhoods, really, that isn't always panning out, and that it leaves not only what was in both places, it was a very disinvested neighborhood, that you then have the capacity to end up with these like kind of shells of very high rent apartments that nobody can actually afford, and also empty retail spaces. And so if we don't change the way that we think about that and actually say, we need to fix that, it's not okay to leave those spaces empty. It does terrible things to the rest of the neighborhood. That's something that we need to really look closely at. And I think that's something we need to look closely at kind of across the board in lots of places, right? Where we're ending up with empty spaces. We need to think more clearly about, well, what does it look like to actually make those affordable? What does it look like to actually give both people as renters or as even homeowners or small businesses longer tenure in their homes?
How do we tie a greater economic growth policy for jobs and for entrepreneurship at the same time for that same place, concurrent with dealing with housing policy? Like all this stuff is siloed, and there's so many angles we can go into. But you're speaking just to all of those resonant things that are at the core of how we got where we are. But we could also change all of this. These are all human-made issues, right?
They're all changeable, right? And I think that's the one thing that does give me some modicum of hope, is that these things are all fixable. These things are all changeable. We can make different decisions, right? None of these things are the laws of physics. They are based on decisions that have been made over long periods of time, but we can make different decisions. We don't have to keep going down that road.
That's right. The book is The Cities We Need, Essential Stories of Everyday Places. The author is Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani. And Gabrielle, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today for the Are We Here Yet podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful to talk with you.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.